Hi, Yinnies, and welcome back to a Yin Yoga podcast. If you're new around here, welcome. If you are a familiar, welcome back. My name is Nick Danu, and I'm your host. And for those of you who are return listeners, if you've listened to a couple or more of these episodes and you've had some ahas, if you've had some insights or some helpful things to help guide you in your yin journey or in your teaching, I would be so grateful if you would take a moment right now. You could even pause this just to go into whatever app you're using right now and leave a review. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you could make sure you've subscribed to my channel, give this a like, and then after the episode, take a moment in the comments to let me know what were your ahas or your takeaways. Was there any light bulb moments for you? For those of you that are listening on a podcast app, whether that be Spotify or Apple or whichever one, if you wouldn't take a moment to give me a 5-star review, I would be so grateful. On Spotify, it's just stars. On Apple, you can do 5 stars, or you could also leave a written review, which would be amazing as well. I know that probably every time you listen to a podcast, you hear a podcaster saying this, and that's because these little things actually go a long way in growing the podcast. So the more reviews and comments and things like that we get, the more likely Apple or Spotify is to show this when people search out yoga podcasts, or when people search out Yin Yoga, or when people search out Yin Yoga podcasts. You get the idea. So help me break through the algorithm and just take a moment. Right now, you can just pause this, go into your app, click on the actual show page. So click on the Yin Yoga podcast page, and then just scroll down, and there's an opportunity there for you to add some stars or a written review. I would be so grateful. And again, if you are on YouTube, you could like the video, subscribe, and then just drop me a comment partway through or near the end with any aha moments that you've had about this particular episode. I would love that. All right. One more thing to remind you of, for those of you that are new around these parts, although I have the soul of a mermaid, I also have the mouth of a sailor. And so you can expect some adult language, and always in these episodes, adult subject matter. So if you have small ones around, take a moment to just pause and grab some headphones now. Before we dive right into today's episode, I wanted to just share some testimonial or review that I got on my 60+ hour therapeutic yin training. And this is from Sneha of Connect and Grow Yoga on Instagram. So at Connect and Grow Yoga. These are her words. 10 out of 10. Everything in the training was new for me, and I totally soaked it all in. My biggest takeaway is that everyone should be doing yin yoga at least a few times a month. Personally, for me, I'm also going to continue learning more about fascia and sinew channels and the 5 elements. I have a great appreciation for the qualities and benefits of yin yoga for one's wellness. I also like the foundations of yin yang theory, the TCM, and the 5 elements that you wove into our training. All of this made the learning comprehensive for me. Thank you. What I loved most about the course is that it created a high quality user experience. The way it was structured, extremely organized, very easy to access the information in regards to reading and homework, etc. So that was from a former student named Sneha, and thank you so much for that. It's always good to know that your hard work and your obsession is paying off in some ways, that it's actually translating to the students. If you want more information about my 60-hour training, I get a combination of people who've already taken yin trainings but feel like there were some holes in their training, their previous trainings. Or I also get brand newbies who just want a good solid foundation in yin yoga. Whether either of those are for you, you can just take a moment in the show notes or below the video if you're on Instagram, and you will see a link that says to get on the wait list. When you click that link, all you have to do is look way up to the very top of the page where my photo is, and there's a little button there that you can push. The text is literally in my picture. You can't miss it. You can click that button, enter your name and email, and that will add you to the wait list. And you'll also get a little freebie from me as a thank you. And you'll get little extras along the way. So you'll get these podcast episodes, you'll get sneak peek behind the curtains of the training. So I'll sometimes share little snippets of videos from the training, other podcast interviews I've been on, cool videos that I find, etc., etc. So you'll get all of that on your way to registration being open. And then once registration is open, I always reach out to the email list first. So the wait list gets first notification. And there's also a discount code for the first 5 people that sign up that only is available on the wait list. So again, if you want to get on the wait list, all you have to do is click the link in the episode notes that says get on the wait list. Click that, look way up into my picture, click the little button, and enter your name and email. And bing, bang, boom, just like that, you're on the wait list. Okay, friends, let's get into today's topic. So we've got a solo episode today, and I'm not sure yet at the time of recording this what I'm going to call it, but what I want to talk about is what in Yin Yoga is known as the rebound. The rebound. Now, I'm not going to call it the rebound basically for most of the rest of this episode, simply because that's not what I personally call it. So if you've listened to the episode where I talked about what is therapeutic yin, then you've probably heard me talk about how, or even when I spoke to Paul in his interview, about how partway through when I started teaching yin to teachers, that I just felt like as I took my yoga therapy training, that some of the words that I was sort of brought up with in my yin community and my yin circles didn't either feel accurate to what I was feeling and what I was witnessing, or they felt like they could be just a little bit more trauma sensitive. And so there was many words that I changed. We'll just talk about the one today, which is rebound. So it's not that I think the word rebound isn't trauma sensitive. I think it's fairly neutral, although, any word could be a trigger for anybody at any time. We just never know. But it didn't feel accurate to me. Because when I come out of a yin pose, I don't feel like I rebound out of it. If anything, it's a lot more slow and gradual, and the sensation just doesn't feel like a rebound. So that's why I started calling it the resonance, or often the linger of the pose in your body. I've heard other teachers call it the echo, which is also, I think, quite nice. So tomato. Instead of using the word rebound, I'm going to be saying resonance or linger. Some people call it echo. It's all the same thing, just different words for different people. And the reason that I wanted to dedicate a whole episode to this is because, and I've said this in other episodes, that sometimes when we were originally trained in a different style of yoga than yin, so if yin wasn't the first style of yoga that you were trained in, then you probably came into yin with what I call some of your little suitcases or your little baggage. So some of the stuff that you learned in your first training, or the attitudes even, or the culture even of your first trainings, and you just bring those into your yin teaching. And that's natural. We all do that. But my hope is that as you begin teaching yin and you get more and more experienced with it and you fall more and more in love with yin, that you start to really observe for yourself and analyze for yourself where some of those things that you brought into your yin training from your more yang styles of yoga aren't actually helpful and maybe not serving the practice, and that we could let them go. So I've talked about that in other episodes and what some of those things might be, and I'm sure I'll bang on about this in many episodes to come. But today I want to talk about the rebound, as it's called by my teacher, or in my vernacular, the resonance or the linger of the pose. So first, let's just talk about what it is, right? And then I could talk a bit more about why it's oh so important. So when you've been doing a yin practice and you've done these longer holds, this enables access to different tissues of the body in a different way than a more dynamic or movement-based practice. So in yin yoga, we access the deep fascia and large bands of connective tissue on of the body. And due to yin's effects on the fascia of the body, coming out of a yin shape can be quite different and quite a different feeling than when you come out of a more movement-based practice shape. So the urge to sort of moan and groan and to move slowly and mindfully is normal. In fact, it's a good sign. I sometimes joke that in some shapes, I feel like yin yoga roadkill. Like I wish that somebody could just come and scrape me up and flip me over so I didn't have to move myself. And so we want to do that. We want to come out slowly and mindfully. And we want to take a moment to notice that feeling in the body. What Paul would have called the rebound, or what I'm going to call the resonance or the linger of that shape in your body. So here's a metaphor that we could use. Imagine if we were all in a room together. Wouldn't that be nice? And I had a big gong in the room. And I asked you all to close your eyes. And then I gave that gong a good hard wallop. When I do that, the sound would be big and loud, and it would fill the space. It would be almost impossible to ignore. And you'd likely feel the resonance of that on your skin and even in your body. So even if you couldn't hear, you would still know that I'd hit that gong because it would be tangible, the vibration of it. And then if we just sat there with our eyes closed for a minute or so and let the sound start to fade, the sound itself and the sensation on or in our bodies would slowly begin to dissipate until it was no longer here with us, or it's off very faintly in the distance. So this is similar to how it can feel when we come out of a yin pose. At first, there's that urge to moan and groan and come out slowly. And the resonance of the pose can feel quite strong, that linger of the shape in your body. But over the course of a small rest period, and this is what we're talking about here when we're talking about the rebound or the resonance or the linger, is taking this small opportunity for rest. And over that rest period, the sensation begins to soften to the point where eventually you feel like your familiar self again and better able to move into the next shape. So when we first come out of the shape, there's this moan and groan, this urge to move slowly and mindfully. And then as we settle into something where we're going to rest, we notice that sensation begin to fade and fade and fade and fade and fade until we feel like we are our familiar self again, or at least enough so that we can take the next shape. Oftentimes, one of the things that happens when we have yin teachers teaching yin, bringing in all of their suitcases and their baggage and things from their hatha classes or their flow classes or whatever other style they were trained in, or even more so, when we have teachers teaching yin yoga that actually don't have any yin yoga training. So this is what happens when we have teachers coming into a yin class to teach with the attitude of, I mean, I can totally teach yin. It's just like regular yoga with longer holds. So when that happens, then some of the beauty and the magic of a yin practice gets forgotten about. And some of these things are crucial, in my opinion, to this practice. So leaving out time for your student or yourself in your own practice to just pause and notice the resonance, the linger of that shape, or in Paul's language, the rebound in your body, to allow for an opportunity to begin to feel like your familiar self again before you move into something else, in my opinion, is a big mistake. Because this, well, there's lots of reasons, which I'll go into, but one of which is being that yin is so unique and so different. And what you're doing here is you're taking one of the most magical things about this practice and sort of shoving it off to the side like it's less important than just hurrying up and getting into another pose. And again, sometimes this comes just from habit. Sometimes it comes from the teacher's discomfort, again, holding space for still and quiet. Right? So I've had a few episodes where I've talked about that. So we can go back and listen to the mind in yin, emotions in yin, or how to hold brave space with grace, if you want to, not grace as in the attribute, but the actual person, Grace. I did an episode with her. So I'll put those in the show notes. Listening to either of those if you want a little bit more on that. If you are a teacher that has this discomfort with the still and the quiet, those would be helpful for you. So the rest and the resonance is super important because not only does it, again, begin to allow our body to feel like its familiar self again before we take something else. That's one reason. But there's more reasons that this is a mistake. The rests in a yin practice are where yin yoga's quiet superpowers become the most apparent. The effects on the fascia. So that urge to moan and groan, that feeling of being a little vulnerable or fragile or not quite put together, allowing that time in that space to notice the effects on the fascia. And so when we move too quickly from one pose to the next, we can miss that feeling of resonance in the yin shapes. So that's a big mistake. And also culturally in our daily lives, most of us, myself included, are often rushing from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. And this can be hard on our nervous system. A lot of times we don't realize it, but that we're actually in our sort of fight, flight, and freeze response more often than we should be to have a healthy nervous system. And so when we're constantly moving from one thing right to the next thing, right to the next thing, right to the next thing, without giving ourselves any moments of pause or slowing down, this is really hard on the nervous system. And this can lead us to feeling rushed and overwhelmed and sort of on edge or like we're on our last nerve. And that can be problematic, not just for our own health, mental health and physical health, but also for how we are in the world. If I'm constantly feeling rushed and stressed and panicked and kind of overwhelmed, then if anything's kind of thrown at me from some other human near me, or animal for that matter, that I wasn't prepared for, that I don't feel like I have time for, I'm likely to be a bit snappish, a bit impatient, or maybe even a downright asshole. Right? So taking time to slow down in life is a good thing. This is why when we go out for walks in nature, we feel so much better afterwards. Or when we take a vacation, once we get over the fact that we're going to have to do less because we're on vacation, that we come back and we feel better. And culturally, we're overwhelmed with this. It's literally programmed in. We live in hustle culture, rushing from thing to thing, not taking the time to rest or to be observant or to notice. So having this opportunity in your yin class gives people this much needed time to sort of bathe in their parasympathetic nervous system, in the relaxation response. So culturally, we're always rushing from one thing to the next. So taking this time to honor this little space between no longer and not yet, and the effect that slowing down has on the nervous system, is a much needed gift. Now, sometimes you can hand people a gift and they don't see it as a gift, right? So sometimes, because we're like this culturally, rush, 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 go, 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 thing, more, more, do it, right? All that stuff. Sometimes this is the challenge for students when they're in a yin class, is the slowing down, is the still, is the quiet, okay? But just because something is challenging for somebody doesn't mean it's not damn good for them. So, I am challenged to remember to take my vitamins. I got to, really put some systems in place to make sure that I remember to take my vitamins. But just because I find it challenging to remember to take them doesn't mean it's not worthwhile for me to take them, right? So just because your students may be a little impatient, a little fidgety, a little irritated, and they may kind of want to quickly move to the next thing, doesn't mean that encouraging them to slow down and giving these deliberate, sacred little pauses in the yin class isn't good for them. It is so good for them. Their nervous systems will really, really appreciate that. Once their mind gets over the fact that this is happening, their body will appreciate it. Their nervous system will appreciate it. Their psyche will appreciate it. So, because we don't take much time in our daily lives to slow down and to honor that little space between no longer and not yet, otherwise known as the present moment, this can be uncomfortable, unfamiliar, awkward for the students, and again, sometimes for teachers, especially if you're newer to leading these quieter practices. You might also feel that pull within you to just hurry up and get to the other side or hurry up and get to the next pose. That doesn't mean that that's what you should do. If it's uncomfortable for you as a teacher, pause, take a couple deep breaths, and be curious. Why is this so uncomfortable for me? So this is one of the reasons why we really need this practice physically, having this resonance time, this rest time to lay there and notice the linger of the pose in our body, allows our fascia and our body to begin to feel like its familiar self again before we move it into some other new shape. Mentally, for our nervous system and our mind, slowing down, taking deliberate sacred pauses is really good for helping us to get into our parasympathetic nervous system, the relaxation response, and away from our sympathetic nervous system, this rushed, panicked, hurry, hurry, go, overwhelmed state that many people are in all the time. Also, sometimes these little rests allow us to access little messages that we might be getting, but not really paying attention to. Little messages in our minds or our hearts, right? So when we're always rushing and moving and doing stuff, it's hard to hear our heart's whispers, little messages from your bigger self, your higher self, that your body or your heart might be trying to tell you. Like, you need more rest. This job isn't right for you. You need to shift some things in your life, for example. These things can come up when we take the time to slow down. When we take the time to slow down, we also notice little messages that our body is telling us. I once heard this quote, and I do not know who it's by because it was not attributed and I've seen it everywhere. So if anybody knows, please let me know who this quote is by. But then when we listen to our body whisper, then we don't have to hear it scream. When we listen to our body whisper, we don't have to hear it scream. So when we take the time to slow down, then we can get curious about, oh, what's that weird little ache there in my body? What's going on there? Maybe I should pay more attention to that. Maybe I should get that checked out. None of these things can happen if we're constantly rushing and moving from thing to thing to thing to thing. And, as yoga teachers, we have zero control over whether or not our students are out in the world being human doings instead of human beings and rushing from one thing to the next thing to the next thing to the next thing. We can't control that. But what we can do is in our yoga spaces, we can encourage this slowing down. We can explain why we might want to slow it down. And I think maybe helpful, especially if you've got a bunch of real fidgety people in your room, to explain that sometimes slowing down is the hardest part of this practice. And so if you find that you're sort of impatiently wanting to move the next thing, or you're like, oh, I'm so bored in this 30-second or a minute, rest that I'm here, just know that's normal, right? So always normalize these things, especially if you see a lot of fidgeting in front of you. So if you're a teacher and you're trying to do this little rebound pause and you just notice that people are immediately rushing to the next side, or they're just super fidgety and impatient or irritated, you can address that, right? Just by saying, sometimes this is the hardest part of a yin practice for some of us, is just giving ourselves permission to slow down and to explore the value of being present in this moment, which is a really tricky place for us to be in culturally. So you can address it with your students. You can address it with yourself. Oh, this is coming up for me. I want to hurry up and just go right to the other side of this shape, or I want to just go right into the next shape. Okay. You notice that in yourself and just ask yourself, what's up with that? Why do I feel the need to hurry up? Hurry up and wait, right? What's the point of hurrying to get to the next shape where you're just going to be there for minutes at a time anyway? So this inability to slow it down, to be present, to be in the moment is sort of a cultural thing. And when we can address that, both with our words and just by actually leaving the space in our classes for these sacred pauses, then we help to cultivate a space where our students' nervous systems can shift from our fight, flight, or freeze response into our parasympathetic response of rest, digest, relax. And most of us really need more time there because our culture is set up to keep us in a sympathetic dominance. This is why so many diseases, chronic diseases, can be linked to stress, right? So slowing down is essential for good health, physically, mentally, and emotionally. And we don't do it. And so sometimes it feels unfamiliar. And then we think because it's uncomfortable that we shouldn't do it. And so we skip over it. But as often in a yin practice, the magic is in the discomfort. This is where our ahas come to us. Okay. So I hope I've kind of sold you on the why. But now let's do a little who and what and the rest of the elements of this resonance or linger in the pose. So when you've done a yin shape, let's just say you've done an asymmetrical shape or a one-sided shape, I like to leave about 30 seconds or so in between before they go to the next side. You will have to remind your students repeatedly to pause because they will just automatically go to the next side. So I always just invite my students to come out, to pause, take some stillness, and to notice, does that first side of their body where they just did the shape feel different than the side where they have yet to have done the shape? And what are those differences? And I also normalize if they don't really notice a difference. So I will literally say, let's take a moment to notice, is there a difference from one side to the other? Now that you've done the shape on one side, do you notice a difference between that side and the side you've yet to do? And the answer might be yes, you do notice a difference. The answer might be no. It might be quite subtle. It might be glaring. All of those are fine. The important part is to slow down and notice. Sometimes all we notice, this is literally what I say, word for word, sometimes all we notice is the urge to hurry up and get to the other side. That's also worth noticing. Just because we have the urge to hurry up and go to the other side doesn't mean we have to do that. We can just go, I'm feeling really impatient. I want to just hurry up and get to the next thing. What's up with that? I can observe that. So if it's in between sides, I usually go for, somewhere around 30 seconds. And I give them some things that they could tune into, that they could look at. Then if we've done either a couple of smaller or smaller held poses, smaller held poses, like in the 2.5 range, if we've done a couple of those, maybe back to back, or if we've done a longer held pose, sort of in that 3 to 5 minute range, then I'm going to allow a full minute for the resonance or the linger or the rest time. And that's just always what Paul did in our trainings. And it's on his old school original Yin DVD. And I know a lot of people don't even realize that Paul had a Yin DVD. Now it's streaming on Pranamaya. You don't have to buy the DVD, but that there's a whole practice video there. Lots of people know about his anatomy one, but they don't know about his practice video. So if you want to see how he used to teach it back in the day, that's a perfect way to check that out. And when I did my training with him, our rests were always a minute. So I don't know if there's any magic to a minute. It's just what he did. It's what I do. It does generally seem like once the students have had a minute, most of them will feel like they can move into their next shape with some moderate comfort. But I also always give the invitation, like if this pose was particularly juicy for you, you're still really feeling it, please feel free to rest longer. We're not in a rush. So if you want to take an extra minute or 30 seconds or whatever on top of what I've allowed, please do so. So just to go over that again, if it's one side to the other side, I take 30 seconds in between the sides and I give them some things that they could tune into. Notice, does one side feel different than the other? Does it not feel different than the other? Is it a subtle difference? Is it a strong difference? Notice if that impatient urge to hurry up and do the next thing is coming up. All of that's worth noticing. That there's no right or wrong thing to notice. The important part is to pause and take the time to notice. That's where the gold is. And usually when I say, if you just notice the impatient urge to hurry up and do the next side, we get a few laughs, right? Because it's almost universal. And then if we've done a longer held shape, 3 to 5 minutes, or if we've done a couple 2-minuters back to back, then I'm going to give a full minute of rest so that they can notice the resonance or the linger of the pose in their body. Now, this feels like a really good time to address something that I will often see, and it usually comes from teachers that were previous vinyasa teachers. Not always, but usually. That they cue movement in these rests and resonance. So instead of just saying, come out of the pose, come into something comfortable, pause and take a moment or two to notice the rest or the linger or the resonance of this pose in your body before we take the next shape. So instead of doing that, they coach them into movement. So come to your hands and knees and let's do cat cow. And now we'll move to the other side. Yeah, well, you're kind of missing the point then. Or come up to downward dog and now we'll do swan on the other side. Well, again, missing the point. So am I saying that your students can't move in that minute of time? No, I'm certainly not saying that. But I do not tell the students what to do in that minute of time. That is for them to go inward and to observe what is happening in their body and to do what feels right for them. So I do not cue movement in a practice where the point is stillness. Now, that being said, if somebody comes out, maybe they're in a shape and they kind of hug their knees into their chest and kind of rock a little bit while they're in their resonance, totally fine. But I'm not telling them to do so. So when you come from a tradition where you're sort of micromanaging every single movement and every single breath of your students, like a vinyasa or an Ashtanga practice, where it's like moving, 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 if that's your primary style that you teach, and then you try to teach a yin practice, you have to watch that you're not pulling that in to your yin practice. Is it okay to move a little bit when you're in your little space between poses? Yes, but that is not an opportunity to take one more yoga pose. So if the student wants to move, if they instinctively move, for sure, they should listen to their body. If they want to be still, they should listen to their body. They should take physically whatever shape their body just asked them to do. I know a lot of yin teachers will say, lie on your back and straighten your legs for every single rest. What if that's not the right thing for their body? So when my students come into a shape and they are ready to explore the rest pose, the resonance, the linger, I will say, maybe you explore this in stillness. Maybe it's a little wiggly for you. Do what feels right for your body. And then I'll give them a few ideas. You could just bring your feet to the floor here. You could lie on your back. You could hug your knees into your chest. You could, depending on what pose they're in, you could, come to laying on your belly. Please do whatever your body just asked you to do, right? So I'm giving them plenty of options, but I'm asking them to do what their body asked them to do. I'm not saying come to your hands and your knees now that we've just done that back bend or that forward fold, and now let's do some cat-cow, right? That's unnecessary. If they want to do that, if they instinctively feel drawn to do that in their own body, let them. By all means, that's what they should do. But there's a couple of things, there's many things that former flow teachers do and bring into their yin practice that need to get left at the front door for a yin practice. And I'm not going to talk about them all in this episode, but one of them is coaching every single moment of their practice with your voice and your cues. Stop talking so much and let them feel and explore their own damn body. So let's just say they were doing swan pose, for example, sleeping swan. I'm not going to tell them as they come out to move to their hands and their knees and do a bunch of cat-cows in between on the way to the other side. No, I'm not. In fact, I'm also not going to tell them to come out to downward dog to switch to the other side. Downward dog is not a yin pose. Now, I'm certainly not going to call the yin police if one of my students does a downward dog in their practice as a way to transition or because that's what feels good for their body. But I'm not going to coach it because this is a yin practice. That is not a yin pose. So, for example, a simple transition, which requires a lot less fussing and movement that nobody seems to teach, is imagine if your student is in sleeping swan and they have their right leg forward, or pigeon for those of you that do not yet speak yin. So they've got their right leg forward, and now it's time to come out, to pause, to notice, and then eventually to transition to the other side. So I'll just tell them, roll over into your front leg butt cheek. So if their right leg is forward, lean over, roll over into your right butt cheek until it comes to the ground. And when you feel solid, stable, grounded, you can slowly bring the back leg around forward and pause for a few breaths. In any shape that your body would like you to do, to notice the difference from one side to the next. And I'll do that for about 30 seconds, give that a little break, and then I'll cue them to go ahead and bring their left leg forward and extend their right leg back. Notice how I just transitioned them out of swan without having to do downward dog or cat-cow or anything. Now, if they want to do that, if they automatically do that, I always let them. Just do what they need to do. I will usually crack a joke and say, and for those of you that think you can't transition to the other side without downward dog technically isn't a yin pose, but don't worry, I won't call the yin police if you want to do one. And that usually gets some giggles. right? But if that's how they want to move and transition, great. But notice I'm not telling them to do that. So if you are a flow teacher and you are used to a lot of movement, you can think that you need to coach movement in between the stillness in yin. You do not need to do that. Can students move? Sure, if they feel called to, or let them have the stillness. But let that little pause, that little time in between the shapes to notice the resonance, the rebound, as Paul puts it, the linger of the pose. Let that be their time to drop into their own body and notice what's there, right? So I will call out a few options if people seem really lost, like you could do this, you could try this, but none of them are movement and none of them are another pose. The point of the rest and the resonance is to be quiet, as still as you can, maybe a tiny bit of movement, but stillness, and to observe what's you're feeling in your body. And when you move right into another shape where you're moving as a little link to get them to the next pose, they miss it, especially if they've been practicing yin for a long time. So rather than coaching movement in between these poses, allow space for spontaneous, organic movement that they might come up with. But mostly give them the time to explore their body, the sensations of their body, any impatience or irritation or emotions that come up at the same time. Allow them to have that space, that individual space for themselves to be curious, to go inward, to notice, to practice interoception. And if you're not familiar with that word, I did a whole episode on that too, which again, I'll link. But interoception, very briefly stated, is an awareness of what is happening inside of them. So this is one of the reasons I'm not a fan of coaching people to come into another pose and do some movement, or another pose is a way to transition into their next side without allowing some resonance and some linger or rebound time. These rests are an essential part of this practice, and downward dog is not a resting pose. Coming into cat-cow and moving is not taking the opportunity to be still and quiet and drop inward and notice what they're feeling in their body. They can't notice how that pose has affected them if they're thinking about doing what it is that you're telling them to do and move in the way that you're telling them to move. You've missed your window, right? This is not a movement practice. This is a stillness practice. And I get that sometimes when we're new to teaching this style of yoga, old habits die hard, as they say. So it can be hard for you not to think that you need to micromanage and create a choreographed every little moment of the class, but you don't. You don't need to choreograph a pose for in between two sides of one shape. You can just let them have that space. So, dear yoga teacher, if you're listening to this, allow them the time for still and quiet. This is one of Yin Yoga's superpowers. They can get all the movement they want. They can get all the clever sequencing they want, all of the choreography that they want, where every single thing flows into something else and you move in all of it in their vinyasa classes. It doesn't need to be in their yin classes. They're two different practices. Okay. Soapbox over, at least on that point. And just, of course, know that sometimes students are a little bit confused or impatient when it comes to taking 30 seconds or a minute to rest. So just address that. Sometimes the hardest part about this practice is giving ourselves permission to slow down and to be curious and to notice. So just know if you find that difficult, that's not unusual. right? Just normalize their experience. You don't take it away. Just because someone's uncomfortable with something doesn't mean we're like, oh, well, you're a little uncomfortable. Guess we got to pull this essential part of the yoga practice out. No, no, no. So when we can give our students the time, the space to pause between sides or shapes, to practice interoception, to go inward, to notice, oh, how does my right hip and butt area feel now compared to my left? Do I notice a difference? Is it a glaring, obvious difference? Is it a subtle difference? Do I not notice a difference? Oh, maybe I just noticed the urge to hurry up and get to the next side. Or maybe my mind is already planning my pizza toppings for dinner. All of it's fine, but give them an opportunity to notice it without you filling the space with more words, more movement, more action, more things to do. They do not need more things to do. They need to learn to experience doing less. So that hopefully, if they can master that in their yin practice, this taking time and space and slowing down and pausing to notice and being curious and not running away as soon as they feel bored or uncomfortable. This creates habits for real life when they're not on their yoga mat and they go out into the world. They are more likely to slow down, to take space in their daily lives, to rest more if they have already experienced it before. And your yin yoga class is a perfect time and place for them to experience that. Allow them to start to understand what it feels like to be a human being, not a human doing. And their nervous system will remember this. And their body will remember this. And their mind and their heart will remember this. Maybe not consciously, but it will remember. And the more they do it, the more it'll remember. And then before you know it, your students are actually feeling more calm and settled and grounded, even when they're not in their yoga practice. And isn't that the point? Are we only wanting them to feel a certain way in yoga? No, we're hoping they take all of these beautiful gifts that a yin yoga practice can offer out with them, bundle them up, and take them out with them out into the world because they are of service to them, to their mental, emotional, and physical health and well-being. Because we live in a culture where it is go, 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 compete, compete, thrive, push, hustle. And there's nothing wrong with some of that. We need some of that yang energy in our world and in our life. Otherwise, we'd still all be living in caves. We never would have discovered fire or created spears or anything else to help us to survive as humans. So, yes, we need some yang energy. But we live in a yang dominant world. We live in a world where yang is praised more than anything else. And these still and quiet and receptive times, which are equally important and equally valid, these yin times don't get much airplay. They don't get much attention. They're not as flashy. They're not as sexy. They're not, they're not all over Instagram. Well, a little bit. But they're super important and super essential. When our students can take the time to be still and quiet and learn to listen to their own body, their thoughts, their mind, their heart, when they're on the yoga mat, then they learn how to do that when they're not on the yoga mat and they're out in their regular life. When they learn how to nourish their nervous system, then they're better able to do that when they're not on the yoga mat. When they have an opportunity to rest, to come to stillness, to move into that parasympathetic nervous system, then they are more loving and kind to the rest of humanity. Because it's very difficult to be a kind human when you're constantly feeling rushed, overwhelmed, and stressed. So this is why this is such an essential part of the practice. And again, for those of you that are looking for the how-to nuts and bolts, very simple. Between one side and the other, just tell them bring your feet to the floor or whatever it is, pause. Say the word to them, pause. Notice, does one side feel different than the other? And if so, is it strong? Is it subtle? Do you not notice that one side feels different than the other? Do you just notice the urge to hurry up and rush to the other side? You only have to coax them a couple times and then they'll get it. They'll be like, oh, okay, right. So in this practice, we practice the pause. Okay. I hope that's given you something to think about for those of you that maybe weren't including this time. And it might mean you do slightly less poses because you're allowing for the rest and the still and the quiet and the introception. And that's fine. Again, this isn't about being a human doing, it's about being a human being. So this is a super important part of the practice. It's a part of the practice that often gets left out, allowing for these small opportunities for rest, to notice the linger, the resonance of the pose in their body, to begin to feel like their familiar self again before they take their next shape, to pause to notice if their mind, their heart, or their body has little whispers to tell them, little things they should know that they're maybe not paying attention to because they're so busy. All of this super important part of this practice. Okay. So just to wrap it up, I'm just going to prove that I am once again a Generation X kid and do my best to embody a little Irish singer. Do you have to? Do you have to? Do you have to? Do you have to let it linger? The answer would be yes. The answer would be yes. Please allow the time for the linger, for the resonance of the pose. Okay, friends, that is all for this episode. Thank you so much once again for listening. And I hope that this has given you some food for thought for your classes. Either if you were including the rest and the linger, maybe you've got some talking points now. If students are struggling, you've got some ideas about why you can explain how important it is. If you have not been including this, if you've been one of those teachers that's been getting people to go right into cat cow, move, 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 now do the next thing, maybe you could stop doing that. I've given you plenty of reasons to try it out. And yes, it will feel uncomfortable for you and for them, especially if you've been teaching your stillness class like a movement-based class. But just because something's uncomfortable doesn't mean it's not valid, doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. In fact, the only true growth is on the other side of discomfort. Okay, my friends, thank you for listening. And until we meet again, bye for now.